Chapter 1. The Storm of Ceres 4. The wind howled through the desolate ruins of Ceres 4, carrying with it the eerie glow of radioactive dust, twisting through the skeletal remains of once great structures. The old outpost city, abandoned for centuries, lay beneath the eternal storm like a graveyard of steel and stone, its towering buildings half buried in sand, its streets covered in a thick haze of deadly radiation. It was the kind of place where only the desperate ventured scavengers, mercenaries, and those who had no other choice. Torrenkane was one of them. He tightened his environmental cloak around him, the reinforced fiber barely keeping out the freezing wind that lashed against him. The storm had arrived earlier than expected, sweeping across the valley like a living force, angry and vengeful. His boots crunched over broken glass and rusted debris, the Geiger counter on his wrist clicking steadily, warning him of the rising radiation levels. He had 2 hours, maybe less, before exposure became lethal. He needed to find shelter fast. His mission had been simple. Infiltrate the ruins, retrieve an old data core left behind in a collapsed research lab, and return before the storm hit. The client had paid well, too well, which should have been his first warning. But credits were credits, and Torren wasn't in a position to be picky. Now, he was stranded in the middle of a radioactive wasteland, his evac ship grounded miles away, the storm cutting off all communication. Damn it. He adjusted his visor, scanning the wreckage ahead. There a collapsed tower, its lower levels still partially intact. It would serve as temporary cover until the storm passed. He moved quickly, climbing over rusted beams and shattered concrete, his breathing steady, controlled. He had been in worse situations before war zones, black market retrievals, deep space wreck dives, but something about this place, about this storm, felt wrong. And then, he saw her. A figure, barely visible through the radioactive haze, hunched against a half-buried transport vehicle. At first, he thought it was a hallucination, a trick of the storm, but then she moved. Torren's instinct screamed at him to ignore her. Helping strangers in places like this was a death sentence. But something about the way she clutched her arms around herself, her fragile form barely visible beneath the tattered remnants of a survival suit, made him curse under his breath. She was dying. No one survived long in a storm like this without protection. Against his better judgment, Torren ran to her. The rescue. The closer he got, the clearer she became a woman, young, her skin pale, almost translucent, a strange contrast to the raven-black strands of hair that had escaped the torn hood of her survival suit. Her lips were cracked, her breath shallow, her eyes, a striking shade of silver half-lidded, struggling to remain open. She wasn't built for this kind of environment. Hey, stay awake. Torren knelt beside her, his voice rough but firm. He reached for the medkit on his belt, checking her vitals. Heart rate erratic. Core temperature dropping. Minor radiation exposure, but it would get worse. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. Torren didn't waste time. He unfastened his environmental cloak, wrapping it around her before she could protest. It would shield her from the worst of the radiation, at least for now. She flinched, staring up at him with something between confusion and shock. Just stay still, he muttered. You're in bad shape. She managed a weak shake of her head. Her lips moved, forming a word he barely caught. No, you. Torren ignored her, shifting her weight against him as he lifted her into his arms. She was too light, far too delicate for someone surviving out here alone. Who the hell was she? The storm was worsening, the radiation rising. They had to move. Torren carried her toward the collapsed tower, his muscles burning with exertion as the wind screamed around them. He could barely see more than a few feet ahead, his visor's filters struggling against the blinding static electricity rippling through the storm. By the time they reached the ruined building, he was half carrying, half dragging her inside. The interior was dark, cold, but shielded from the worst of the storm. He set her down against a broken console, checking her again. She was still awake, barely. Her silver eyes studied him, a mixture of wariness and something else, something he couldn't quite place. Torren exhaled, removing a small canister from his medkit. Here, he said, pressing it to her lips. Drink. She hesitated but obeyed, taking slow, careful sips. For a long moment, there was only silence, the storm raging outside, the faint hum of old technology buried beneath the rubble. Then, finally, she spoke. You shouldn't have saved me. Torin raised an eyebrow. Yeah? Well, I'm not in the habit of leaving people to die. She studied him again, her silver eyes narrowing. You don't know who I am, do you? Torin leaned back against the opposite wall, exhaustion creeping into his bones. Should I? She was quiet for a long time. Then a bitter laugh. You just risked your life for a princess. Torin blinked. What? She exhaled, closing her eyes briefly before meeting his gaze again. I am Princess Kayla Veldran of the Syrian Empire, and you just became the most wanted man in the quadrant. Silence. Torin stared at her. Then, slowly, he exhaled. Of course you are. Chapter 2. A fugitive princess and a doomed man. Torin stared at Kayla Veldran, his mind racing as her words settled into his bones like a lead weight. A princess. Not just any princess, a Syrian royal. His gut twisted. The Syrian Empire wasn't just another galactic faction. It was one of the largest and most feared powers in the quadrant. Their reach spanned entire solar systems, their fleet was unmatched, and their rulers were gods among mortals. If they had lost a princess, they would burn planets to find her. And he had just saved her life. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The storm outside continued to howl, shaking the walls of their temporary shelter. The flickering emergency lights from the old wreckage cast long shadows, reflecting off Kayla's silver eyes, her face a mask of calm despite the chaos she had just unleashed. Torin exhaled slowly. You've got to be kidding me. Kayla didn't flinch. I wish I was. He ran a hand through his dust-covered hair, trying to force his thoughts into something resembling logic. Okay, let's start simple. Why the hell is a Syrian princess stranded in the middle of a radioactive wasteland? She hesitated. It was subtle, but he caught it. He narrowed his eyes. That's what I thought. Kayla exhaled, pulling the tattered remnants of her survival cloak tighter around herself. I didn't expect anyone to find me, she admitted. I was supposed to be gone before the storm hit. Torin scoffed. Yeah, well, good job with that plan. Really airtight. She shot him a glare. I had an extraction team waiting on the outer ridge. But before I could reach them, I was betrayed. Torin stilled. Betrayed, he echoed. She nodded. Someone tipped off the Imperial Guard before I could escape. My transport was shot down, and I barely made it out alive before the crash. I had no choice but to hide here. Torin's eyes flicked toward the charred ruins of what must have been her escape ship, now buried beneath tons of rubble. His stomach sank. They're coming for you. Kayla met his gaze. They were coming for me before you ever found me. Torin clenched his jaw, his mind already calculating the odds. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was suicide. The Syrian Empire had resources beyond imagination. If they thought he had their princess, they wouldn't just kill him. They'd make an example out of him. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to think clearly. All right, fine. Betrayal, assassination attempts, crashed ships, I get it. But what I don't get is why a Syrian princess is running in the first place. Kayla's expression didn't change, but he saw the flicker of something deep in her eyes. Pain. For the first time, she looked away. Torin's instincts flared. Whatever she was hiding was bigger than just a political dispute. Finally, she whispered, because I refuse to be a pawn. Silence stretched between them. Torin exhaled. That's vague as hell, princess. She gave him a sharp look. I'm not your princess. Well, you sure as hell aren't mine either, he shot back. And considering you just made me a galactic fugitive, I think I'm owed a few damn details. Her jaw tightened. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she did. They were going to force me to marry a warlord. Torin blinked. Come again? Kayla's voice was flat, but there was an underlying fury beneath it. The High Council arranged a marriage. Not for my benefit for power. My father, the Emperor, needed an alliance with the Zyrek Dominion, and their warlord demanded my hand in exchange. Torin felt a slow wave of nausea settle in his gut. The Zyrek Dominion was a brutal regime, infamous for its merciless conquests and ruthless warlords. Their leader, High Commander Vorian Kale, was a monster, and they had planned to give her to him. His fists clenched. And when you refused? Kayla's lips curled into a bitter smile. I became expendable. Torin understood immediately. They hadn't just wanted to force her into marriage. They had planned to get rid of her entirely if she resisted. She hadn't just run away. She had fled for her life. Torrin exhaled slowly, his mind racing. All right, let's say I believe you. He met her gaze, voice deadly serious. That means we have a much bigger problem. Kayla frowned. What do you mean? Torrin gestured outside, where the storm continued to rage. The Syrians aren't just searching for a missing princess anymore. If they know you survived the crash, they'll assume someone is helping you. Realization dawned in her silver eyes. Torrin's jaw clenched. They'll be searching for both of us now. The hunt begins. As if on cue, the ship's emergency sensors flared to life. A faint holographic warning flashed across the display, old but still functional. Torrin's stomach dropped as he read the words. Incoming signal detected. Vessel identified. Imperial Syrian interceptors. Distance, 14 kilometers. ETA, 30 minutes. His pulse spiked. They found us, he growled. Kayla stood up immediately, her expression turning sharp. They wouldn't have detected us unless they were already scanning the region, Torrin finished, his mind working fast. They know your ship crashed here. They're searching the wreckage for your body. Kayla's breathing hitched. She hadn't expected them to find her so soon. Torrin moved quickly, grabbing his weapons and gear. We need to get the hell out of here. Now. Kayla didn't argue. She grabbed his cloak, fastening it around herself as he led her toward the back exit of the ruined tower. Torrin's mind raced. 14 kilometers. That wasn't much distance. They had maybe half an hour before the Syrian forces would arrive. And when they did, they wouldn't leave survivors. The escape. They slipped into the abandoned ruins, moving through the twisting remains of ancient corridors, avoiding open spaces, staying low. The storm would shield them from aerial detection, but the Syrian forces would be using ground drones, scanning for heat signatures. Torrin gritted his teeth. We need transport. Kayla's voice was tense. If they landed an escort team nearby, they'll have transports we can steal. Torrin shot her a look. You sure about that? She gave him a fierce smirk. I was raised in an empire of warlords. Trust me, I know how to steal their ships. Despite the chaos, despite the storm, the pursuit, the imminent danger. Torrin found himself grinning. All right, princess, he muttered. Let's go steal ourselves a ride. And with that, they disappeared into the ruins, running toward the only chance they had to survive. Chapter 3. Stolen Ships and Silent Promises. The wind screamed through the ruins of Ceres 4, whipping dust and radioactive ash into the air as Torrin and Kayla moved swiftly through the broken streets, their cloaks wrapped tightly around their bodies to block out the worst of the storm's fury. The ruined city stretched endlessly around them, a graveyard of steel and shattered glass, where the bones of a forgotten civilization rotted beneath the red glow of the storm overhead. Torrin's boots crunched against loose rubble as he kept his blaster rifle at the ready, his eyes scanning for movement, for the inevitable patrols that would be sweeping the area soon. Beside him, Kayla moved with the silent precision of someone trained for survival, her lithe frame weaving through the debris with the grace of a shadow, her silver eyes burning with a quiet determination that made it impossible for Torrin to forget who she truly was. A princess. A fugitive. A woman worth an entire empire. Torrin exhaled, forcing himself to focus. He had no time to dwell on the insanity of his situation. Right now, their only goal was escape. And that meant stealing a ship fast. Kayla suddenly halted, pressing a hand against his chest to stop him. Torrin stiffened, barely breathing as he followed her gaze toward the towering ruin of an old docking station, its skeletal remains half buried beneath the sand. But the real threat wasn't the ruins themselves, it was what lurked beyond them. A Syrian landing craft. Torrin narrowed his eyes, adjusting the settings on his visor to cut through the storm's interference. Through the hazy red glow of the swirling dust, he could just make out the dark metallic hull of an Imperial gunship, sleek and deadly, its emblem of the Syrian Empire emblazoned across the side. The ship was surrounded by a squad of soldiers, their midnight black armor gleaming beneath the harsh floodlights illuminating the wreckage around them. They were moving methodically, scanning the ruins, searching. They're looking for you, Torrin muttered. Kayla's jaw tightened. I know. His grip on his rifle tightened. So what's the plan, princess? Because I don't think they're just going to hand us the keys. She turned her gaze toward him, her silver eyes sharp with purpose. We don't need the keys. Torin raised an eyebrow. No? She smirked. Just the pilot. A dangerous game. They moved swiftly, weaving through the ruins, staying low, staying silent. The soldiers were spread out, their formations tight, covering all angles, their movements precise and efficient. This wasn't some low-ranking patrol squad. These were Imperial enforcers. Elite operatives trained for combat, extraction, and assassination. Torin wasn't sure if they had been sent to rescue the princess or eliminate her. Either way, he didn't plan on giving them a chance to decide. Kayla led them toward the outskirts of the landing zone, where the gunship's auxiliary power generators were exposed, the maintenance hatch partially open. It was a weak point, one she clearly knew existed. Torin whispered, "You sure about this?" She nodded. "I studied these models as a child. I know their weaknesses." He gave her a skeptical look. "You studied gunship schematics as a kid? Must have been one hell of a childhood." Kayla's lips quirked slightly, but there was no humor in her expression. "You don't grow up in the Syrian royal court without learning how to escape it." Torin exhaled sharply. "Fair enough." They moved quickly, slipping beneath the underbelly of the ship, Kayla disabling the external security locks with practiced efficiency. The moment the hatch unsealed with a faint hiss, they were inside, moving through the dim corridors of the gunship's lower deck. The ship was mostly automated, designed for minimal crew operation, but they weren't alone. Torin heard the footsteps before he saw the guard. A Syrian soldier, moving down the corridor toward them, his rifle held casually but his posture still alert. Torin didn't hesitate. He moved with lightning speed, closing the distance in seconds, catching the man from behind and locking his arm around the soldier's throat in a brutal chokehold. The guard struggled, reaching for his weapon, but Torin tightened his grip, cutting off air, holding firm until the man collapsed unconscious. Kayla raised an eyebrow. "Efficient." Torin shrugged. "Loud guns get us killed." She didn't argue. Instead, she crouched beside the unconscious soldier, removing his ID chip and slipping it into the ship's control panel. The console flared to life, recognizing the biometric signature, and the cockpit doors slid open. They stepped inside. The pilot was seated at the helm, unaware, his attention focused on the storm diagnostics flashing across his screen. Kayla moved like a ghost. Before the pilot could react, she was behind him. One swift strike to the back of the neck, and he was out cold. Torin whistled. "Remind me never to piss you off." Kayla ignored him, sliding into the pilot's chair, her hands flying across the controls as the ship whirred to life. The engines rumbled beneath them, and the holographic displays shifted, recognizing the new authority override. Torin raised an eyebrow. "That easy?" Kayla smirked. "I told you. I know these ships." He settled into the co-pilot seat, glancing at the external scanners. His heart sank. "They're moving. We don't have much time." Kayla didn't hesitate. She punched the engines to full thrust. The gunship roared to life, lifting off the ground just as the first soldiers outside realized what was happening. Torin heard the panicked shouting over the comms, the sudden blare of alarms as the Syrian enforcers scrambled to react, but it was too late. Kayla hit the afterburners, and the ship blasted into the sky, leaving the ruins of Ceres 4 behind. The aftermath. They didn't speak for a long time. The ship's controls hummed quietly, the gentle vibration of the engines the only sound filling the cockpit. The storm was far behind them now, the toxic wasteland of Ceres 4 shrinking beneath them, fading into the darkness of space. Torin leaned back in his seat, letting out a long breath. "Well," he muttered, rubbing the tension from his temples. "That was a goddamn disaster." Kayla arched an eyebrow. "We survived." He shot her a look. "Yeah. And now we're officially wanted fugitives flying a stolen Imperial gunship." She smirked. "I don't see the problem." Torin laughed despite himself, shaking his head. "You really are insane." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You saved my life back there. You didn't have to." Torin shrugged. "Yeah, well, I didn't really think it through." She smiled then. A small, genuine smile. And for the first time since this whole mess started, Torin wasn't sure if he regretted it. Chapter 4. A Kingdom's Price. The stolen Syrian gunship hummed quietly as it cut through the vastness of space, its engines purring like a restless predator. Torin Kane sat in the pilot's seat, his grip firm on the controls, his gaze locked on the stars stretching endlessly before them. The escape had been clean, but the reality of their situation was anything but. The moment he had wrapped his cloak around Kayla back in that radioactive storm, the moment he had chosen to pull her into his arms instead of leaving her to die, his fate had been sealed. He had been a scavenger, a fixer, a nobody. Now, he was the most wanted man in the quadrant. And all because of the woman sitting beside him. Kayla Veldran, princess of the Syrian Empire. Fugitive. Rebel. His problem. She was quiet, her silver eyes locked on the view beyond the cockpit, watching as the swirling dust of Ceres 4 became nothing more than a memory. Her hands were steady, her expression unreadable, but Torin wasn't fooled. She was thinking, calculating, preparing for whatever came next. Finally, she broke the silence. We can't keep running. Torin sighed, leaning back in his seat. I know. She turned to him, her expression sharper than before. The moment I fled, my father would have sent out every fleet, every assassin, every bounty hunter he could find. He won't stop. Not until I'm either back in his palace or dead. Torin tapped his fingers against the controls. And which do you think he wants more? Kayla's lips curled into a bitter smile. That depends on whether he's still convinced I'm useful to him. That was the real problem. Kayla wasn't just a runaway princess. She was an embarrassment, a liability, a spark that could set fire to the Empire's control. As long as she lived, she represented something the Syrian throne couldn't afford, a defiance that might inspire others to do the same. Torin shook his head. So what? We just sit back and wait until they send an armada after us? Kayla's gaze didn't waver. No, we don't wait. We strike first. Torin blinked. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. She smirked. Then you haven't heard enough. He exhaled, rubbing his jaw. Let me guess. You know someone. A hidden ally. Some underground resistance? She nodded. There are people who hate the Syrian throne as much as I do. Exiles. Pirates. Fallen nobles who lost everything when my father expanded the empire. If I can reach them, if I can show them that the throne isn't as unshakable as it pretends to be. Torin arched an eyebrow. You want to start a war? Kayla leaned forward, her voice quiet but intense. A war is coming, Torin, whether I want it or not. The only choice I have is whether I face it alone or with an army at my back. Torin studied her, taking in the fire in her silver eyes, the steel in her spine. He had met a lot of people in his life, mercenaries, smugglers, warlords, but none of them had ever looked at him like this. Like he wasn't just another man drifting through the stars. Like he mattered. Finally, he sighed. And let me guess. You expect me to just sign up for this suicidal plan of yours? Kayla tilted her head. You could leave. Right now. Take the ship. Disappear. You don't owe me anything. Torin stared at her. She meant it. But leaving meant going back to the life he had always known, running from planet to planet, fixing broken things, never standing still long enough to care. He thought about the radioactive storm, the way she had clung to him, the way she had whispered his name like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. He thought about the fire in her voice, the way she refused to bow, even when an empire was bearing down on her. He thought about how, for the first time in years, he wasn't running from something. He was running toward it. Torin sighed, rubbing his temple. You're really going to make me say it, aren't you? Kayla smirked. Say what? He groaned. Fine. I'm in. She grinned. Good. Torin pointed a finger at her. But if we get killed, I'm coming back from the dead just to haunt you. Kayla laughed, shaking her head. Deal. He turned back to the controls, setting a new course. The Syrians would be coming. They wouldn't wait. They wouldn't hesitate. But now, neither would they. Epilogue. Shadows of a throne. Deep within the Syrian imperial palace, a chamber of darkness and gold lay silent. The emperor sat at its center, his golden eyes reflecting the flickering holographic display before him. A projection of his daughter. A voice spoke from the shadows, calm and cold. She escaped. The emperor did not move. She did more than escape, he murmured. She fights. A pause. And the man with her? The emperor's lips curved slightly, but there was no warmth in the expression. A scavenger. A soldier without a banner. He tapped a finger against the armrest of his throne. But now, he is something else. He exhaled slowly, his gaze distant. My daughter has found her sword. A sharp breath. Shall we send the fleets? The Emperor smiled. No. The shadowed figure hesitated. No? The Emperor leaned forward, his voice velvet over steel. Not yet. Let them believe they have won their freedom. Let them rally their rebels. Let them think they have a chance. He exhaled, a whisper of amusement in his tone. And when the time comes, we will remind them why the throne is eternal.